going to be looking at the biblical period, all about the kings. And specifically, I want to help you understand all of these types of books, particularly the book of Chronicles. Chronicles is a book that often gets overlooked. When you're reading through your Bible, you get to Samuel, you read about King Saul and King David, you get to 1st and 2nd Kings, and you're reading about all of the kings, and then you come to Chronicles and you figure out, oh, this is a story about the kings of Israel. And there's an assumption that Chronicles must be giving the exact same history as Samuel and Kings is. And so a lot of Christians will overlook the book of Chronicles. They think, it's just the same story, same material being given a second time. But the book of Chronicles is actually massively different from both the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. And so this morning, what I want to do is talk about how these books are different, how they're similar, and kind of give you the tools to be able to read this and really get a full depth of these amazing books for your personal devotional time. So let's begin by looking at what makes these books similar and different from one another. Now, we'll go through a lot of information this morning, but don't worry, we'll be simplifying it, and I'll be making sure that we just get down to the basics ultimately to help you in your Bible study. So the books of Samuel and Kings we're actually going to group together because they're very similar. They were written by two different people, and we're not sure who wrote Samuel. And for the book of Kings, the best guess people have is the prophet Jeremiah. So we'll use Jeremiah for the sake of just making it easy to talk about. And the way in which Samuel and Kings are similar to one another, first of all, is they have a prophetic viewpoint. So they're both written by prophets. And the way that they decide to talk about their nation's history is through political history. And this makes sense because the prophets were the kind of advisors to the kings. So they often involved themselves in the politics of the nation. So one example is that the prophets who wrote Samuel and Kings, to let you know what the spiritual condition of the country is, they'll tell you how the political realm or political sphere of the country is at that time. One of the major ways is they'll tell you how wealthy the kingdom is, or if the economy is in a bit of a decline. So for example, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10 is the start of a theme that runs all the way through the books of the Kings. And it tells us about how under the reign of a good king, the country prospers and there's wealth everywhere. And then under the reign of a bad king, or when a good king is messing up, we see that the wealth of the country declines. So 1 Kings chapter 10 and verses 14 and 17. This is under the reign of King Solomon. It says, "The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traveling merchants, from the income of traders, from all the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the country. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He also made 3,000 shields of hammered gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon." So we're told that during King Solomon's reign, it's kind of like a golden age period for Israel in their history. And to describe why this is happening, well, Solomon at this point, he hasn't yet fallen into idolatry. He's doing the right thing, and we're seeing that God is blessing the nation, and they're prospering, and we're told King Solomon has these hundreds, thousands of shields made of solid gold. Shields made of gold. Then we come a few chapters over to chapter 14. Chapter 14, verses 25 and 28. This is a little bit later. This is now when the kingdom has been divided, and it's under the reign of a king called Rehoboam. Let's see what happens to the wealth of the country. 1 Kings 14:25. "It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. Then King Rehoboam made bronze shields in their place and committed them to the hands of the captain of the guard who guarded the doorway of the king's house. So Rehoboam is not a very good king. And we see that what God allows is for these enemies to come and plunder the nation because of this king's disobedience. And we're told that all the gold shields that Solomon made are taken away. And now Rehoboam, he wants to make some shields again, but he doesn't have the gold. So he makes bronze shields instead. So it's a way of showing to us as readers the kind of spiritual up and down of the nation by looking at their history. Now, the last two passages we won't read through together. You can have a quick read through in your own time. But again, it mentions that another king, he has to give away all of the gold in their treasuries in chapter 15. And 2 Kings 12 is the same. It's this, an invading army comes and the king has to give all of the gold and the treasure they have. And the reason always is God has allowed an invading force to come in because the king and the people are not obeying him. So this is a very common way that the writers of Samuel and Kings are trying to communicate to us the spiritual condition of the nation of Israel. When times are prosperous and things are going well, it's because God is blessing the people for their obedience. And when they're in times of economic crisis, God's allowed this to happen because they have wandered away from him. So what are some of the other ways in which the writers of Samuel and Kings want to communicate to us the story of God and his people? Well, one of the ways is they have this big emphasis on the moral quality of the kings, and they talk a lot about the royal vices of the kings. They talk about all of the good and bad kings, all the good stuff that was done, but also a lot of the bad. And kind of the end statement after giving all of this history, the overall evaluation of the kings of Israel and Judah is they weren't great. They were pretty bad kings. They weren't good rulers for God's people. And because of that, Samuel and Kings includes both the kings of northern Israel and southern Judah. They want to give a complete picture for us of why it is Israel ended up in such bad shape. And it's because the kings were not good, both north and south. And this is the really important part. These books were written soon after the events of the exile. So the people are taken into exile into Babylon, and assuming again this is Jeremiah or another prophet similar in that kind of time space, the purpose of the writing of these books was to show Israel how they ended up in exile. So if we wanted to summarize everything in that big chart, the message is, here is why everything went wrong. That's what the author is trying to communicate to Israel. Look at our history. If you want to know why we are now in Babylon today, look back at our history. We had bad king after bad king after bad king. And the people kept following idols. They kept wandering away from God. This is why we're in exile. So that's really the main message. That's the main takeaway for us to remember of what Samuel and Kings is trying to communicate to us. This is how we ended up in this mess. That's the main message. Chronicles has a completely different message from these other two books. And that's because it's written at a completely different time in Israel's history. Rather than being written right as soon as they go into exile, the book of Chronicles is written right after they've left exile from Babylon. So this is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and most people speculate Ezra might have written Chronicles. And so rather than looking back at all of the problems of their history, Chronicles is trying to inspire and encourage the Israelite people to look forward with hope and optimism. This is a message to a people that are rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the temple. They're rebuilding their homes. And so what they need right now is a message of hope, something that's going to inspire them to rebuild the temple, something that will inspire them to have pride in their ancestry and their heritage. And so the book of Chronicles, it looks at some of the same history, but rather than looking at all of the bad kings, Chronicles focuses on all of the good kings. It excludes all of the bad kings in Israel's history. So that's why there are that should be northern kings. There are no northern kings mentioned in Chronicles. So King Ahab and King Omri and Jezebel, all of those stories, none of them are there because all of the kings of northern Israel were terrible. And Ezra doesn't want to discourage the people. He wants to get them to reflect on the times in their history where things were good, when they had good kings. So he only talks about the kings in the south because they had a few good kings, but again, sadly, mostly bad ones. And so rather than focusing on all the problems and all of the wrong things that the kings did, the book of Chronicles wants to tell you all of the good things the kings did. They give a positive evaluation of the kings and say, look, we can go back to the way things used to be. We can go back to the time of Solomon and David and Hezekiah, all of the good kings in our history. So Chronicles has a very different message. If Samuel and Kings is all about, here's why everything went wrong, Chronicles is all about, here's how God is going to make everything right. One's looking back and saying, here's how we ended up in this mess. The other's saying, how do we look forward to the future with hope for our people? And so the easy summary to remember what the book of Chronicles is about is 3 R's. They are royalty, roots, and religion. That's what the author of Chronicles, Ezra, is trying to teach the people. He's saying, look at our royal ancestry that we have. We're a proud people who come from a line of kings and good kings. Let's go back to our roots. These are people who are in need of being told what their ancestry and heritage is. They've just come out of exile. They need to be reminded of the roots that they have as a nation. And importantly, they need to be taught about their religion. Ezra talks a lot about the temple and how grand and magnificent the temple was back in the day. So all of the stories are being constructed to encourage and inspire and to remind the people of their roots, their royalty, and their religion. So let's compare now how Samuel and Kings comes across with Chronicles. How are they similar? How are they different in the stories that they tell? We've understood now they have 2 very different goals in mind because they're written at 2 very different times. Let's have a look what stories are included in Chronicles and which ones get missed out. So we'll talk about 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, again, we have this assumption, isn't most of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles? There are actually only 2 stories that are featured in Chronicles that are in 1 Samuel. Only 2. So almost none of 1 Samuel you will find in the book of Chronicles. So what stories get left out then? There's only 2 that make it in. Which are the stories that get left out? It's a long list. It's everything to do with Samuel, everything to do with Eli, the Ark of the Covenant getting taken by the Philistines, Israel demanding a king, Saul reigning as king, Saul persecuting David, and Saul's eventual death and demise. All of these stories are not present in Chronicles. So the question is, why? Why did Ezra choose not to include any of this history when he was talking about the kings and their past and their history? Well, remember, Ezra wants to talk about good kings. He wants to highlight the periods where things were going good for the country. Saul is not a good example of a good king. He dies a tragic death. So Saul is not mentioned in Chronicles. The only thing that's mentioned is he dies. And we're not told any other details. It just says Saul was king and he died. So Saul's history is gotten rid of. And Samuel was the advisor to Saul. So there's not much use for Samuel if you're not going to tell the story of Saul. So Samuel gets omitted out as well. Eli is omitted. He's a bad priest. Ezra wants to talk about good priests, good representations of their religion. Eli's not a very good example, so Eli is not included. And then the time of Saul persecuting David is not included because we want to think of David as a triumphant hero, not as someone who was on the run for most of his life. So it's very interesting how Chronicles is trying to tell a different story. It's the same history, but trying to tell it from a different perspective to encourage and inspire people. How about 2 Samuel? What stories are not included in Chronicles that we would find in 2 Samuel? Well, there's nothing to do with David struggling to secure his throne. In 2 Samuel, so 2 Samuel goes from David becoming king, him reigning as king, and just before he dies. That's the period 2 Samuel covers. And the first few chapters of 2 Samuel are all about how David has to secure and kind of consolidate his power as king when Saul dies. But Chronicles is not interested in telling that story. It just wants to show you that David became king. So it goes, Saul died, and then it jumps straight into David being a king with no worries whatsoever. There's no struggle, there's no problems. He just becomes king. And we're also not told about the time one of his own sons, Absalom, rebels against him. Again, Ezra wants to inspire the people. So a story where one of David's own sons pretty successfully overtakes the kingdom from him is not the type of story that Ezra wants to include. Now, the most fascinating one is that the story of the Bathsheba incident is not found in Chronicles. Ezra, again, wants to paint a good picture of who David is. In fact, let's have a read of where we see this big gap. So let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11 is where we find the Bathsheba incident on full display. Remember, Samuel is, the books of Samuel and Kings are trying to tell us this is why we're in this mess. So they're putting everything out on the table for us. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, and we'll just read verses 1 and 2. And of course, the Bathsheba incident is David sees the wife of another man, sends that man to die in battle so he can take his wife. One of the most despicable things we read of in the Bible. 2 Samuel 11, it says, "It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed, walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold." And then we get the story of the Bathsheba incident, how David brings Bathsheba to him, kills her husband Uriah, and then we read that David's son dies as a consequence. And in the very end of the story is verses 29 and 30. Just quickly turn to verses 29 and 30 in 2 Samuel 11. That's in chapter 12 now. Chapter 12, 29 and 30. It says, "So David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah, fought against it, and took it. Then he took their king's crown from his head. Its weight was a talent of gold with precious stones, and it was set on David's head. Also he brought out the spoil of the city in great abundance." So remember, the first verse is about sending Joab out to do war, besiege Ammon and Rabbah. And then the end of the story tells us he goes out to Rabbah and he successfully takes this kingdom. Now let's have a read of how 1 Chronicles is going to tell us this story. So this is 1 Chronicles chapter, let me have a look. First Chronicles chapter 20. And notice how the words are exactly the same, and yet there's a big part of the story missing. First Chronicles chapter 20. This will sound very familiar. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time kings go out to battle, that Joab led out the armed forces and ravaged the country of the people of Ammon and came and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem, and Joab defeated Rabbah and overthrew it. So now in Samuel, verse 2 says, and David saw Bathsheba, a very beautiful woman to behold, and then tells us the story. But notice what happens in Chronicles. Verse 2 says, then David took their king's crown from his head, found it to weigh a talent of gold, and there were precious stones in it, and it was set on David's head. Also he brought out the spoil of the city in great abundance. That verse is from chapter 12, the end of the Bathsheba story. What's missing? The Bathsheba story. We get the exact same beginning verse, the exact same end verse, and yet the whole story of Bathsheba is completely omitted. Now, here's what's very important for us to remember. Ezra is not trying to cover up this history. He's not trying to rewrite history. He knows full well that if people want to know about the Bathsheba incident, they can go read the book of Samuel. Instead, what he's trying to do is give an idealized version of history. And this is very important. It's not an idolized version, putting these people up on pedestals to be worshipped and to receive unnecessary praise. But it's an idealized version of their history, focusing on all of the good parts. So the Bathsheba incident is gotten rid of. We get the start verse, we get the ending verses, but the actual story is gone because we want to remember the times where David was faithful, not the times where he failed. So what does Chronicles emphasize about David's rule then? If it doesn't want to look at all the bad things and the mistakes and failures he made, well, it wants to emphasize all of the successful parts. There's a lot of talk about his successful military campaigns. So if you're still in First Chronicles, just have a quick glimpse at chapters 18, 19, and 20. Just have a look at the headings there. And you'll notice probably all of the headings have to do with David's conquests or his enemies being defeated. And these are stories that give much more detail than Samuel ever gives. He wants to emphasize, we were a nation that was expanding our borders. We were doing well under David. He also, Chronicles talks a lot about the abundance of religious officials in the nation. So have a look at chapters 23 to 27. Just read the headings and you'll see there's things like the divisions of the Levites, divisions of priests, musicians, gatekeepers, treasurers, military duties, leaders of the tribes, other state officials. Ezra is going into incredible detail talking about, look at all the staff that David had when he was at his prime. This was a good period in Israel's history. And he talks a lot about, again, the prosperity that the nation had under King David's rule. So we're kind of in the home stretch now of comparing these books. How does Chronicles and First Kings measure up with each other? Well, First Kings starts with King Solomon, tells us about how Solomon was prosperous and then less prosperous. He apostatized, he became an idolater and was led astray to worship idols. And then we see that the nation gets divided into two. So they can't even keep together as one anymore. And then we get all of these lists of bad kings that's in First Kings. And the last half of First Kings is pretty much dedicated to the story of Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah, all who are in the northern part of Israel. So what does Chronicles decide to omit from this story? Well, they don't talk about the sin and the fall of Solomon. If you read Chronicles, you will have the impression that Solomon was faithful and didn't make any mistakes in terms of idolatry. And they talk about how good things were under Solomon's reign. You'll also find no northern kings. There was not one good northern king. Isn't that a sad fact? There was not one good northern king. So if you read through Chronicles, it's almost as if the kingdom never divided. It just continues the line of good kings through the line of Judah. There's nothing to do with Elijah. Elijah is not in Chronicles at all. You won't even find his name. And yet he's such a common, popular character that we all know. But because he's got to do with northern Israel, he's not included. We don't want to talk about Ahab. We want to talk about our good kings, like King Asa. And that also means Elisha is not mentioned in Chronicles either, the protege, the successor to Elijah's prophetic ministry. So what we do find included, though, is all the good kings, all of the good southern kings, the times where they reformed things, the times where they worshiped God and encouraged the people to worship God, the times they got rid of idols. Those are the stories that are focused on in 1st and 2nd Kings. So what then are the unique things that we find in Chronicles? We've said all of the stuff that you can't find in Chronicles. What does Chronicles have that Samuel and Kings can't give to us? That's an interesting question, isn't it? What's unique that we can learn and draw from in Chronicles in our personal devotion life? Well, Chronicles is big on genealogies. So if you go all the way to 1 Chronicles chapter 1, go to 1 Chronicles chapter 1, and the book starts with genealogies, because it's trying to remind the people of one of those 3 R's, which is their roots. Where are people who go all the way back to Adam? So the very first verse of Chronicles chapter 1, it says Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. It goes through all of the history. And then you go to chapter 2, it continues. Chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. The first 8 chapters of Chronicles is trying to remind the people, you're a proud people who have roots that go all the way back to Adam. And it traces all of their history right to the present day. So there's a lot of genealogies in Chronicles because it wants to remind the people of their roots. You also find a lot to do with the priests and Levites. We looked at that already, talking about, look how many priests and Levites and treasurers and musicians and gatekeepers we had. And they seem a bit irrelevant to us because we think, well, I don't know who these people are. There's a long list of names and we don't know who they are. But it would have been important to the people reading, and it would have inspired them. Hey, let's rebuild the temple. Let's do our best to bring back our musicians and our gatekeepers and the Levites. Let's rebuild what we once had. There's also a lot of extra details to do with the temple. And that takes up about 7 chapters, all the way from 22 to 29. We looked at that earlier. Really focused on the temple. Why? Because they're about to rebuild the temple. So he's trying to get them to think back to how the majesty of the temple that they had built. There's also a lot to do with the reforms of good kings. Now, 1st and 2nd Kings gives a little bit of detail about the reforms, but Chronicles goes into incredible detail, telling you everything that Hezekiah and Jehoshaphat and King Asa did to bring back people into a worship of who God is. And finally, the last part of the book is different. Let's go all the way to the last part of 2nd Chronicles. The very last part of 2nd Chronicles. Because the way 2nd Kings ends is with the people being taken into exile. It's a very dour, very somber ending to the book. And it fulfills its purpose perfectly, which is to make Israel remember, here's why we're in exile. Here's why we're in this mess. But Chronicles gets to have a different ending, because now they're going out from exile. So 2nd Chronicles chapter 36, verse 22. Chapter 36, verse 22 says, In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me, And he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. What a hopeful ending to the book. The prophecy of Jeremiah has been fulfilled, that after 70 years, the people can return back home. And the book finishes on a note of optimism and hope for the future. The command of Cyrus is given for the people to go up and go rebuild Jerusalem. So as you can see, there are a lot of unique aspects to Chronicles that we miss out on when we skip over it and think, this is just Samuel and Kings all over again. I hope that we've been able to discover together how different these two books are, and how unique Chronicles is, and in the message that it has for us. And so I hope that I've given some tools for you to use to read through these books and really get a great message that God has put in them. Now, if you want something to help you in your study, I've put together a little resource. I did this for myself, and I want to share it with you. It compares every story that you find in Samuel and Kings with its equivalent in Chronicles. So it looks a bit like this, and you'll see, so I've got 1 Kings here, and the reference and what the story is, and whether it has an equivalent in Chronicles. So you can see here in Chronicles, there's none of these stories are included, but we get a story here that's similar. So as you're reading through Samuel or Kings or Chronicles, something like this would be handy, because it'll make you think, I should go have a look, see how the story is similar or how it's different. And now you'll know why the story is told differently. That's right, Ezra wants to tell me that this is a good king. Or, Ezra's included this because he wants to emphasize the importance of the temple. So if you just scan that little QR code, you'll get that document. I had a look though, and unfortunately, like most things on Word, it didn't convert perfectly. So if you want, let me know, and I'm happy to email you a resource. And I've got one physical version for one, I guess, whoever asks me first. First in, best dressed for the physical copy. I hope that can be a resource that will really enrich and deepen your Bible study. It was something that I found a very rewarding experience, and helped me put this message together, just comparing the different stories and going, wow, that's fascinating. How two different stories, or how the same story, the same people's lives can be told just a little bit differently to convey a different message to its readers. And I want to challenge you as well to put into practice what we've looked at this morning. So I want to give you a few questions for you to study in your own time to kind of put into practice the things that we've learnt this morning. So here are some questions that you can explore and look for yourself if you want to do some study in the book of Chronicles. For example, what key story before Saul's tragic death is omitted in Chronicles, and why? Why is the story of David caring for Mephibosheth omitted? Why is the role of Hiram the craftsman in building the temple omitted? What extra details about the reforms of good kings are added in Chronicles? And how is the story of King Manasseh different in Kings and Chronicles, and why? They're just a few questions to kind of tease your brain a bit and get you a little bit into practice, into figuring out what are the similarities and differences in these books. And just to help you, start that journey of getting real deep into these amazing books that God has given to us. So to finish, I want to make this not only relevant for our devotional life, but for our Christian journey as well. I want to ask the question, why is this important for you and for me? Well, again, when Ezra wrote the book of Chronicles, he wanted to inspire the people by reminding them of their roots, their royalty, and their religion. And what's incredible is each of these main points is fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus came from that same genealogy we read in those chapters in Chronicles. He comes from Adam. He's from the line of David. He's from Solomon and all the kings of Judah. Jesus is the ultimate good king. He's the one really that Ezra was looking toward. We've had all of these good kings. We can have a great kingdom again ruled by the Messiah, the Messianic king. So Jesus, he fulfills those roots that is so prominent in this book. Jesus is royalty. He is, as we said, the best king. And Jesus brought the religion of the temple onto earth. Jesus, his name, Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus was that tabernacle, the presence of God dwelling with his people. And remember, Jesus said, you tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days, referring to himself. So Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of the roots, the royalty, and the religion that Chronicles is so focused on. And so if it's all fulfilled in Jesus, that means it's very relevant for you and me today. Paul, he writes in Galatians that we have been grafted into the family of Abraham. And so now, even though we don't have Jewish blood, we are a part of the same roots that Jesus was a part of. We are part of the roots of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So when you read the genealogies of Chronicles, you're not reading someone else's history, you're reading your history. The family tree in Chronicles is your family tree. Those are your spiritual roots. And in a way, sometimes our spiritual roots are perhaps even more real than our blood roots. These are the people that we are connected with in our faith. We too are royalty. We have been told by Peter that we serve as a royal priesthood who will one day rule alongside Jesus in heaven. So we have a connection to God and his royalty. And again, we're told, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, do you not know that you yourselves are the temple of God and that the Holy Spirit dwells in you? The temple again has been brought to earth in a very real way where God's presence is now in his people. And so the Holy Spirit, God's presence, dwells in us. So this theme of roots and royalty and religion, it wasn't just relevant to the people coming out of the exile. It's a message that is relevant for you and me as well, because all of it has ultimately been fulfilled in Jesus. So my prayer, my hope for you this morning is that you'll bury yourselves in these incredible books. Take time to read through the book of Chronicles. See the amazing message that God has for you inside it. And be encouraged and inspired that we too need to hear the message of our roots, our royalty and religion that has been fulfilled in Jesus.